Now, debt collection is another interesting and useful area of a company's cash management operations, and follows on from the assessment of creditworthiness by customers. Having made the decision to sell on credit, it now becomes a question of actually chasing the cash. If clients pay their invoices on time, that's the end of the story, and that's really the best outcome, of course, but one cannot really leave it to chance, and therefore it becomes important for a company to have not only a team available that can follow up punctual payments of receivables, but there has to be a clear policy on what to do, what steps to be followed in the event that a client does not pay on time. We can't leave it to the employee's initiative to, on a case-by-case basis, to just make up the rules as they go along. Management is obliged to put into a written document and to distribute a written document that clearly outlines the policy of the company and specific procedural steps that should be followed in each case with regard to collecting. Companies that have much more such policies in place usually find that they are much more efficient and effective in being able to get clients to pay on time. The problem really is one of understanding whether a client is able but unwilling to pay, or willing to pay but unable. It's not a late payment is a late payment one way or the other, but it's important to be able to look behind the scenes and to be able to understand more precisely what is motivating or causing the late payment. And to the extent that one is able to interact with the client, in other words, know your client, a major rule which cuts across all types of businesses. Knowing your client is really half the game to understanding what it is that's causing the impediment with regard to payment on time. There are very few clients who are actually willing to admit that they have financial problems, and therefore it's left to the company that's trying to collect its money to sort of guess why or what's motivating the late payment. If one knows early enough that a client is experiencing difficulties, then of course there can be a common solution, a cooperative pathway forward that will preserve the relationship with the client. And of course nobody really wants to allow such relationships to deteriorate where to the point where they end up in a court of law, because suing and so on is a very expensive and timely exercise, and really only the lawyers benefit from such a step. One practice which is quite common in the payments in business is the idea of companies taking unilateral deductions. In other words, they pay less than the full amount of the invoice, usually on some kind of pretext that they're not completely satisfied with the quality of the goods, or that the delivery was late and things like this, in the hope that the supplier will write off the difference, because it may not be worth while chasing small unpaid amounts that are due. Now, this is a phenomenon which has been observed in various countries. It has been quantified, and it's actually quite a huge amount of money which in its accumulation, and therefore it's a practice which one has to take note of when setting up credit collection procedures. Let's just go through. Here's a checklist, really, of the sorts of things that a company has to have in place to be able to manage its its credit control function properly. That is to flag late payers. That means to be alerted to late payers. Follow-up system, specific staff doing specific types of follow-ups. This can be letters, telephone calls, emails, and so on. And of course, with an elevation of difficult cases to the more experienced staff. Training is very important for staff to be able to be motivated and to understand how to handle the client on the phone. One of the rules, for example, is never get angry. So this is a very interesting subject because it has to do with interpersonal relationships. Remember, at the end of the day, one business owes another money, but it's actually people who have to speak to people in order to get the money actually collected. At some point, it may be necessary to get lawyers involved. One starts with in-house lawyers, but then an external lawyer may need to be engaged, especially if one is considering going the route of litigation. And also there are different types of collection agents that exist, factors and so on, who can buy receivables, or collection agencies that can be engaged to chase up a client. They're experienced in a systematic follow-up to collect money. The experience with such collection agents is that obviously the good ones, they save management time in doing the intensive work of collecting money. They can also be somewhat expensive as well, but may well be worth the effort. It's really an individual case by case or determination that a company has to make if it's worthwhile for them to involve a collection agent. Okay, so we have said with regard to credit policies now, in an earlier session, we pointed to, for example, early payment discounts, how important it is for any company and its financial management to be able to evaluate the financial implications of extending credit or not. This would be, for example, if one is selling on 30 days terms and one believes that by extending payment terms to 60 days, there will be a benefit to the company in doing so. So this is a technical issue which needs to be rigorously analyzed in a cost-benefit sense to the company based on a cost of capital presumption. There are other things that a company can do in getting to its cash quicker. Remember, the whole name of the game is to get the cash ASAP. That means as soon as possible. Now, there are different ways in which this can be accomplished. A company, for example, can use a factor, or it can have its invoices discounted by a financial firm or a bank. The distinction here is useful. Candidates should take note of the fact that an invoice discounting involves getting a cash advance against a short-term loan, effectively, against the outstanding receivables that it has. The unpaid invoices may be delivered to the company that provides the finance as a kind of collateral, and the discounting process means that the borrowing company, that is the company who has to collect on the invoice, they receive less than the face value of the invoice. So there's a financing cost involved to be able to convert the invoice into cash quicker. And that's all it is. So it's just a provision of cash. Now, if factoring is more, the third party is more involved in terms of debt collection, a factor will actually chase the receivables. They will effectively buy the receivables, and they will manage the process of collecting from a client. And there are a couple of levels at which factoring is done. One can be on a recourse basis, which means that if the payment ultimately fails and the invoice is not paid, then the factor has the right ultimately to cover this write-off from the original company that it bought the invoice from. In other words, that the company that issues the invoice is still ultimately liable for the credit risk of the invoice. That's called with recourse financing. If a factor is involved to the extent that they buy the invoice with no rights of recourse, non-recourse, that means the factor is bearing the full credit risk of the debtor, and therefore clearly this is going to be more costly. In other words, the discount at which they will buy the invoices will be bigger because the credit risk has to be factored into the price that they would pay for the invoices. So an important distinction here to keep in mind. The invoice discounting is more just a liquidity measure, but factoring in its non-recourse form involves natural transfer of the party bearing the credit risk. Okay, and finally we have just a few of the typical processes here following up credit collections. We've already touched on this from the human or psychological and interpersonal element. These are sort of the generic steps that any credit policy should address in terms of the timing and form of the reminders that go out to clients.